The descent was smooth, too smooth. The ocean, usually restless even in its depths, felt stagnant, almost as if time had stopped. The only sound in the deep was the steady hum of their rebreathers, the occasional click from their equipment, and the unnatural silence pressing against them like a vice. The first thing they saw as they neared the wreck was its name, stenciled cleanly across the hull in perfect, unblemished letters. USS Kronos 2099. The numbers gleamed under the faint beam of their helmet lights. The protagonist, Daniel Hayes, felt his breath hitch. That couldn't be right. The lettering was crisp, untouched by rust or decay, yet the ship was resting at a depth where nature devoured everything within years. This wreck should have been corroded, overgrown with coral, home to scavengers. But it wasn't. Instead, it looked new. "We're looking at something impossible," came a voice in his earpiece. Mac, the lead sonar technician. "This ship, hell, I don't even recognize the make. There's no record of anything called Kronos ever being constructed." Daniel exchanged a look with his partner Reese, who was already sweeping his light across the hull, searching for damage. There was none. No sign of impact, no explosion scars, not even barnacle growth. "This isn't right," muttered Reese. "A ship from the future? How the hell does a ship from the future end up at the bottom of the ocean?" Daniel exhaled, adjusting his grip on the tether. "We find out. Let's get inside." The entry hatch groaned under their touch, but to their surprise it wasn't sealed shut by pressure or corrosion. It opened too easily, as if the ship was waiting for them. Inside, the air was stale, but breathable. Impossible. The emergency lights still glowed along the corridor walls, flickering like dying stars. The ship had power, faint but present. The walls were pristine, free of algae or sediment, yet the air was filled with an eerie stillness, like stepping into a room that had been locked away for centuries. The team moved cautiously, sweeping their lights across the corridors. The ship was dead silent, except for the occasional creak of shifting metal, but that wasn't what unnerved them. It was the absence of bodies. A shipwreck always left remains. Somewhere, there were always bones, remnants, something. But here, there was nothing. No corpses, no sign of struggle. It was as if the entire crew had simply vanished. Reese's voice cracked through the radio. "This is giving me some serious ghost ship vibes, man." Daniel moved toward the bridge. "Let's check the logs. We need to know what happened here." That was when the first glitch happened. A burst of static crackled through their comms, making all of them freeze. The lights along the walls flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows. And then, for just a split second, Daniel saw something. Movement at the edge of his vision, the brief outline of a figure standing in the hallway, tall, motionless, watching. But when he swung his light toward it, there was nothing, just empty air. His pulse pounded in his ears. Did anyone else see that? Silence. Then Mac, his voice quieter than before. "See what?" Daniel hesitated. "Nothing. Keep moving." They reached the bridge, a massive control room lined with advanced displays that should have been long dead, but still pulsed faintly with residual energy. Daniel ran a gloved hand over the captain's chair, dust-free, untouched, as if someone had been sitting there not long ago. And then Reese cursed loudly. "Jesus, look at this. The ship's manifest. A digital screen, still functioning. The date of departure, November 3rd, 2099. The log entries were mostly corrupted, a series of garbled symbols and scrambled text, but one stood, the ocean had always held its secrets, swallowing ships, people, even entire histories beneath its crushing depths. But nothing had ever prepared Daniel Hayes for what they were about to find. The job was supposed to be routine, just another deep-sea salvage. The briefing had been short, the details vague, but that wasn't unusual. Not all wrecks had neat little stories, especially the ones that weren't supposed to exist. A sonar anomaly had been detected in a trench nearly 4 miles below the surface, deep enough that the pressures could collapse a human body in seconds. There were no records of a crash, no distress signals, no survivors. Yet something rested there, waiting. Daniel had worked in ocean salvage for over a decade. He'd seen Titanic-era wrecks torn apart by time and scavengers, oil tankers rusting away into the abyss, submarines that had vanished without a trace, only to be found decades later. Their crews still strapped into their seats, skeletons staring at dead screens. But this one felt different. The coordinates placed the wreck far from any known shipping lanes. There was no storm on record, no seismic activity that could explain a sudden sinking. It had simply appeared, as if dropped there by something that didn't obey the laws of time or logic. Daniel sat in the cramped submersible, listening to the quiet hum of the life support systems as the vessel descended into darkness. The three others with him, Reese, Mac, and Jansen, were all seasoned divers, but even they were uncharacteristically quiet. No jokes, no light-hearted banter. The only sound was the distant crackle of static over their comms, a background noise they had long since learned to ignore. Depth at 3,500 meters, Jansen muttered from the controls. The ocean outside their reinforced glass viewport had turned pitch black, the only illumination coming from their floodlights, cutting weakly through the murk. Strange pale fish flickered past, vanishing into the abyss almost as soon as they appeared. Daniel checked his wrist-mounted sonar. The wreck was close. Then the first anomaly happened. The sonar screen flickered. For half a second, the shape of the wreck blinked in and out, as if something had disrupted the signal. Mac, monitoring from the main ship above, radioed in. Guys, something's weird down there. Our sonar just bugged out. We lost you for a second." Daniel frowned. "We're still here." "Yeah, I know, but for a second the entire ship disappeared off our readings, like it wasn't even there." Reese let out a slow exhale. "Well, that's not ominous at all." Jansen ignored him. 500 meters out, I'm getting visuals." Daniel turned toward the main viewport, eyes narrowing. The floodlights swept forward, illuminating the first glimpse of the wreck. At first, it was just a shadow, an unnatural void in the water. But as they got closer, the details came into focus. A massive hull, pristine, untouched, no coral, no rust, no signs of decay. It shouldn't have looked like this. At this depth, even the Titanic had been reduced to a ghost of steel and sediment, devoured by bacteria and time. But this ship could have sunk yesterday. Reese let out a low whistle. "That's impossible." Mac's voice crackled through the radio again. "Okay, guys, I don't know how to say this without sounding insane, but we just ran the numbers through the database again. There's no record of any ship going down in that area." "None." Daniel's grip on the controls tightened. "Well, there's a ship here," he muttered. The name stenciled across the side of the vessel loomed in their lights. USS Kronos 2099. Silence filled the submersible. It was Reese who finally spoke, voice tight. 2099. That's a joke, right?" Mac's voice was quieter now. "Guys, I think you need to get out of there. This doesn't feel right." Daniel ignored him, his mind racing. The ship couldn't be from 2099. That was decades in the future. But the hull was intact. The structure was unlike any known vessel. "Jansen, bring us closer." The submersible drifted forward, their lights sweeping across the bridge. The windows were unbroken, dark and empty, like the eyes of a corpse. But as they passed, Daniel swore he saw something move behind the glass. A shadow. Watching. The static on the comms grew louder. Reese whispered, "What the hell is this place?" Daniel didn't answer, because deep down he already knew. They had found something that shouldn't exist, and whatever had brought it here was still waiting. The ship that defies time. The deep-sea submersible inched closer to the USS Kronos 2099, its floodlights sweeping across the impossible vessel, resting in the abyssal darkness. Every instinct in Daniel's body screamed at him to stop, to turn back. But the logical part of his brain, the part trained to investigate, to salvage, to explore, forced him forward. Jansen's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the controls, guiding their craft alongside the ship's impossibly preserved hull. This ain't right," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. Reese, usually the first to make light of any situation, remained silent. His fingers were locked around the armrests of his chair, knuckles white beneath his gloves. Daniel swallowed hard, staring at the hull's stenciled numbers, 2099. "We need to document this," he finally said, his voice steady despite the icy fingers creeping down his spine. Jansen exhaled sharply through his nose. Yeah? And who the hell do we send the report to? NASA? The Pentagon? I don't think we have a department that covers ships from the future. Reese let out a nervous chuckle. Yeah, that's an interesting insurance claim. Mac's voice crackled in over the comms. Listen, guys, I ran the name USS Kronos through every database we have access to. Nothing. There's no ship by that name, past, present, or future. It doesn't exist. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then what the hell are we looking at? The static in the comms spiked suddenly, a piercing screech that made everyone wince. Then, just as quickly, it faded. And a voice, warped, distant but unmistakably human, whispered through the channel, "Help! Us!" The four men in the sub froze. Jansen's face drained of color. What the fuck was that? Mac's breathing was audible over the radio. Tell me one of you just said that. Negative, Daniel said immediately. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his voice remained level. That transmission didn't come from us. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel checked the equipment, his fingers moving on autopilot. Mac, confirm. Did you just receive a distress signal? There was a long pause before Mac finally responded. I don't know. It wasn't a full signal, just interference. But it sounded... He stopped himself. It sounded old. Jansen's breath hitched. Oh, Jesus. Daniel turned his attention back to the ship. The windows were dark, the interior completely lifeless. And yet, something gnawed at the edges of his perception, an overwhelming wrongness that he couldn't explain. Reese exhaled slowly, forcing himself to move past his fear. We're going in, aren't we? Daniel hesitated for only a second before nodding. Yeah, we're going in. Jansen maneuvered the submersible carefully, aligning the docking hatch with an external airlock on the Kronos. The metal looked pristine, no corrosion, no biological growth, as if time had never touched it. All right, systems check, Daniel muttered, unclipping his harness. His hands still felt clammy inside his gloves. Reese powered up the oxygen scrubbing system in their suits. All green, we're good to exit. The exterior pressure equalized with a slow, ominous hiss. The doors groaned open, exposing them to the void. Daniel was the first one through, stepping into the airlock of a ship that shouldn't exist. The floor was clean, too clean. At this depth, even sealed compartments should have accumulated some level of moisture, corrosion, something. But the walls gleamed. The corridors stretched ahead, dark and silent. Jansen whistled under his breath. This place is giving me huge Event Horizon vibes. Daniel ignored him and pressed forward, his flashlight beam flickering across the walls. Then he saw it. The first body. At least it looked like a body. It was curled against the bulkhead, frozen in a fetal position. Its suit was similar to theirs, but the material was unfamiliar, sleek, reinforced with an odd metallic sheen. Its visor, however, was shattered. And there was nothing inside, no skull, no human remains, just a void, as though something had scooped the person out and left the suit behind. Reese gagged. Oh, fuck me. Daniel swallowed the bile rising in his throat. Mac, are you seeing this? Mac's voice was distant, tinny. Yeah, I'm seeing it. He hesitated. Guys, I think we need to stop. Jansen stared at the empty suit. Yeah, I'm with Mac. Let's not be the guys in the horror movie who ignore all the warning signs. Daniel took a shaky breath. Every instinct told him to leave. And yet, he turned his flashlight toward a door labeled Bridge Access. We need answers, he said. The bridge was alive. Unlike the rest of the ship, its consoles flickered dimly, casting eerie glows against the glass panels. A few screens still displayed partial data streams, looping cryptic messages. Warning, time anomaly. Detected entry error. System corrupted destination. Coordinates invalid. Jansen moved cautiously to one of the terminals. His gloved hands brushed against the surface, revealing smudged fingerprints. Somebody was here, he whispered. Daniel's eyes darted to the main command station. A logbook, an actual physical logbook, rested open on the captain's chair. He flipped through it. The last entry was dated November 3rd, 2099. His blood turned to ice. Reese peered over his shoulder. Read it. Daniel licked his lips and began, "Final entry. We have made a grave mistake. The anomaly was not a passage, it was a door. We assumed we were moving through time, but we were wrong. We were moving into something else, and something moved into us." The lights flickered, the static in their radios hissed. Then, somewhere deeper inside the ship, a door slammed shut. Jansen took a sharp step back. "Nope, we're leaving." Daniel's grip tightened on the logbook. "We have to—" "You need to leave." The voice came from the communication system, but it wasn't Mac. It was warped, distorted. It carried the hollow echo of something that had learned how to imitate speech, but had never been human. "It's already here." Reese sucked in a sharp breath. Who said that? The air felt heavier, the walls seemed closer. A cold whisper brushed against Daniel's ear. "It's watching." Every screen on the bridge blinked out, and in their reflection, standing behind them, something shifted. Entering the unknown silence swallowed them whole. Daniel's breath hitched as he spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a desperate blade. The reflection on the blank screen had shown something, someone standing behind them. But the bridge was empty. Yet the weight of unseen eyes pressed against his skin, heavier than the crushing water outside. Jansen was already backing toward the door. "I don't like this, man," he muttered, his voice just shy of a whisper. "I don't like this at all." Reese was frozen, eyes wide, staring at the darkened screens as if willing them to flicker back to life, to undo whatever had just happened. His hand trembled over his radio. "Mac, you copy?" A burst of static. Then, you guys... Mac's voice came through, but it was choked, as though he was struggling to breathe. "I don't know what's going on, but you need to..." The transmission cut out. The lights flickered. The automatic doors at the far end of the bridge slammed shut. They were trapped. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. His brain screamed at him to move, to do something, but all he could do was stand there, gripping the logbook as though it were a lifeline. And then he heard it. A sound. Faint at first, a soft rhythmic tapping. It came from the darkness beyond the bridge doors. "Jansen," Daniel rasped, voice barely audible. "Do you hear that?" Jansen didn't answer. His expression was drawn tight, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cold. Reese swallowed hard. That's Morse code." Daniel's pulse spiked. "What?" Reese turned, eyes flicking between them. I studied it in my early training. That's a pattern." The tapping continued. A slow, deliberate beat. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap, tap, tap. A longer pause. Tap. Reese's lips parted, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's spelling something." Jansen's patience snapped. "I really don't give a fuck what it's spelling, man. We need to get the hell out of here." Reese wasn't listening. His hands moved instinctively, tapping against his own thigh in sync with the unseen pattern. Then he went still. "It's spelling RUN." A beat of silence. Then, a metallic scraping sound erupted from beyond the bridge doors, a deep, slow dragging, like metal against metal, like something pulling itself forward. Daniel's breath hitched. "Open the goddamn door." Jansen scrambled toward the control panel, fingers flying over the manual override. I'm trying." The scraping grew louder, closer. Something was coming. Daniel clenched his jaw, shoving his fear deep, forcing himself to think. They needed a way out. They needed a vent. His eyes snapped to the ceiling. Emergency maintenance access ran along the ship's spine, a narrow crawl space designed for engineers in the event of electrical failure. "Up there," he pointed. "We can go through the vents." Jansen hesitated only a second before hoisting himself up, gripping the metal grates and yanking them open. Reese followed. Daniel was about to climb when the bridge doors creaked open, only an inch, just wide enough for something to slip through. And then he saw it. A hand, or what used to be a hand. It was too long, the fingers stretched and gnarled like something caught mid-mutation. The nails were blackened, curling inward like claws. The flesh was a sickly grey, translucent in places, revealing dark veins pulsing beneath. And then it moved. The fingers twitched, then curled. A shudder rolled through Daniel's spine as the thing, whatever it was, gripped the edge of the door and pulled. The gap widened, a breath, a whisper, a voice so close to human it sent ice through his veins. You should not be here. Daniel launched himself upward into the vent just as the door burst open. Reese grabbed his wrist, yanking him inside. They didn't look down. They didn't dare look down. The three of them scrambled through the narrow crawl space, the metal groaning beneath their weight. Jansen's voice was a harsh whisper. Where the fuck do we go? Daniel didn't know. His mind raced, trying to recall the schematics they'd studied before entry. The ship's layout was similar to modern designs, but the technology was wrong. Too advanced. Too different. And yet, the storage bay, he said. There should be escape pods. Jansen barked out a hollow laugh. Escape pods on a ship from the fucking future. Daniel's voice was grim. Do you have a better idea? Jansen gritted his teeth, said nothing. They kept moving. Below them, the sound of dragging continued. It was following. They reached a vent access point above the storage bay. Daniel peered down, heart hammering. The room was vast, lined with sleek sealed crates. At the far end, a row of cylindrical pods stood silent. Bingo, Jansen breathed. Reese moved first, sliding out of the vent and dropping down. Jansen followed. Daniel hesitated, his gut twisted with a sensation he couldn't name. Something was wrong. And then, a voice, but this time it was Reese's. Hey guys, what if we're not supposed to leave? Daniel felt his blood freeze. Slowly he turned. Reese stood next to him in the vent, eyes wide. But Reese was also standing below, looking up, smiling. The thing that wore Reese's face tilted its head, and then, with a sickening crack, its mouth stretched open. Wide, too wide. You should not be here. Daniel didn't think. He fell out of the vent, landing hard, pain jolting up his leg. The thing in the vent moved, and then it dropped after him. Daniel hit the ground running. Jansen was already inside one of the pods, shouting for them to hurry. Reese, the real Reese, was dragging himself toward the escape hatch, eyes wide with terror. Daniel yanked him forward just as the thing hit the floor. It did not move like a human. It jerked, its limbs twisting, its mouth grinning. The last thing Daniel saw before slamming the escape pod door shut was the thing wearing Reese's face, pressing against the glass, and whispering, "We were never meant to leave." The crew that never left the escape pod shuddered violently as it ejected from the ship's docking bay, the propulsion system screaming against the crushing depths of the ocean. Daniel could barely breathe. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the alarms flashing red across the pod's interior. Jansen was hyperventilating beside him, gripping his harness so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Reese sat across from them, head tilted downward, lips parted slightly as if he were still trying to comprehend what had just happened. The thing that wore Reese's face had been right outside the glass. It had whispered to them, and then, as the pod detached, it had smiled. A human smile, only it wasn't. Jansen's voice cracked, and he swallowed thickly before trying again. Did you see that? Did you see what it did to its... Daniel inhaled shakily, trying to slow the wild stammer of his own heart. He could still see it. The thing. The way its mouth had stretched beyond what was humanly possible, its teeth jagged and uneven, like something only half-formed, half-remembered. It wasn't real, Reese muttered, voice eerily calm. None of this is real. Daniel snapped his head toward him. What? Reese lifted his gaze. His eyes were distant, unfocused. This isn't real. The ship isn't real. It's a trick, a hallucination. Jansen let out a ragged breath, pressing his palm against his forehead. I wish it was a hallucination, man, but I felt it. I felt that thing's breath against my face before we shut the door. Reese didn't respond. He just kept staring ahead. Outside the escape pod, the ocean swallowed them in an abyss of black. There was nothing beyond the glass but infinite pressure, the crushing weight of the deep squeezing in from all sides. Daniel reached for the pod's control panel, trying to override the emergency sequence and reroute them toward the Raven, their ship. The console flickered, glitching as if something was interfering with the signal. No, 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 he whispered, adjusting the manual settings. What's wrong? Jansen asked, his voice tight with panic. Daniel shook his head. I don't know. The guidance system is... The pod jerked violently. An alarm blared. Something had stopped them. A cold sensation crawled up Daniel's spine as he glanced toward the external camera feed. At first he saw nothing, just darkness. But then, movement. From the corner of the screen, something shifted. Daniel's blood ran cold. It was impossible. They had launched from the ship. They had escaped. But there, on the camera feed, the 2099 was still with them. Its hull loomed just beyond the glass, but it wasn't the same as before. The ship had changed. The metal plating had warped, the edges curling like burnt flesh. The windows had darkened, and behind the glass, silhouettes stood motionless, watching. Jesus Christ, Jansen breathed. That's not possible. Daniel's fingers trembled over the controls. We cleared the wreckage. We shouldn't be near it anymore. Reese suddenly sat forward, his expression vacant. We never left. Jansen whipped his head toward him. What the fuck are you talking about? Reese blinked, and for a moment the overhead lights cast shadows across his face in just the right way, making him look like the thing they had seen in the ship. We never left, he repeated. Daniel's breathing hitched. Jansen unlatched his harness and lunged for Reese, grabbing him by the collar. Shut the fuck up, man. We escaped. You were there. Reese's head tilted, his lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile, and then the lights in the pod cut out. Pitch-black silence swallowed them. The only sound was the slow, wet breathing from the darkness. Jansen's scream was cut short by a sickening crack. Daniel reached blindly in the dark, his fingers colliding with cold, damp skin. Not Reese, not Jansen. Something else. A voice whispered against his ear, its breath freezing against his skin. Welcome back. A blinding flash of white light exploded inside the pod. Daniel slammed his eyes shut, his skull rattling from the sudden shift. When he opened them, he was back inside the ship, the 2099th. The pod was gone. Jansen was gone. Only Reese remained, standing motionless in the dim corridor, staring ahead. Daniel gasped, stumbling backward against the cold metal wall. His body trembled, his mind screaming that this wasn't real, that this couldn't be happening. But the corridor in front of him stretched endlessly, and at the far end, the thing that wore his own face stood smiling back at him, the message that wasn't meant for us. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, his back pressed against the cold metal wall of the 2099. His mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. He had been in the escape pod. He had been out. Now he was back inside the ship. Reese stood a few feet ahead, motionless, his posture unnaturally rigid. The air around them was dense, heavy with an electrical charge that made Daniel's skin prickle. Beyond Reese, the corridor stretched into an impossible void of darkness. And standing at the far end, the thing that wore Daniel's face, it didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The overhead lights flickered, a dull hum vibrating through the walls, and in that brief moment of darkness, the thing was closer. Daniel's stomach lurched, his pulse hammered in his throat. When the lights flickered again, it was closer still, then closer. Then, it was right in front of him. Daniel didn't scream. He couldn't. The air had been sucked from his lungs, his throat locked in an invisible grip of terror. The creature tilted its head, studying him with an eerie, unnatural curiosity. Its skin looked wrong, too smooth, too perfect, like a mannequin carved in his likeness. It smiled. Then, slowly, it lifted its hand. A perfect replica of Daniel's hand, and it pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. The instant contact was made, Daniel's mind fractured. He saw everything, flashes of memories that weren't his. A sea of voices whispering in a language he couldn't understand. A presence older than time itself, shifting in the blackness of the abyss. He saw the 2099 floating through an impossible void. Not sinking, but traveling. Not a wreck, but a vessel. The walls around him twisted. The ship groaned, metal bending and snapping, as if something inside it was waking up. Daniel staggered, breaking away from the creature's touch, his body shuddering violently, his vision blurred, static crackling at the edges of his perception. "Reese," his voice came out as a rasp. "Reese, we have to—" Reese turned toward him, slowly. Daniel's blood ran cold. Reese's eyes were gone. In their place, two deep, hollow voids, black as the abyss outside, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. It wasn't a storm. Daniel froze. It wasn't a current. A sound like static hissed through the ship's intercom, warping the air. It was waiting. Daniel's knees buckled. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, to do something. But the ship shifted again. The lights died, and in the darkness, the voices began to laugh. A distorted recording crackled to life over the speakers. Emergency log transmission. Crew of the 2099 last report filed. Daniel's breath hitched. The voice on the recording was his own. If you are hearing this, it's already too late. The escape that almost wasn't Daniel's mind reeled. His voice on the recording, his own words, spoken from a place he had no memory of. The 2099 was no longer just a wreck. It was alive. The walls trembled. The floor beneath his feet vibrated with an unnatural energy. Static poured from unseen speakers, layered over with distorted, warped voices, speaking in a chorus that didn't belong to this world. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't a current. It was waiting. Reese took a shuddering step forward, his hollow, blackened eye sockets reflecting nothing but endless void. Daniel knew, without understanding how, that Reese wasn't Reese anymore. It had taken him, and now it wanted him too. The shadows around them writhed, stretching like living tendrils, reaching for him. Daniel ran. The ship's corridors twisted in impossible directions, shifting, stretching, folding in on themselves. Every turn led him back to where he had been seconds before. The air grew thick with the scent of salt water and rot. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. Then, the control room. His hand slammed against the metal doorway, forcing himself inside. He reached for the terminal, his fingers shaking as he tried to reactivate their submersibles. The screens flickered to life, but the data was wrong. The 2099 wasn't resting at the ocean floor anymore. It was moving. His stomach lurched as he realized what the ship had been waiting for. Them. It had been waiting for them to enter it. And now it was taking them somewhere else. A scraping sound behind him. Daniel turned, his heart hammering. Reese, or whatever was left of him, stood in the doorway, head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You have to see it," he whispered. Daniel stepped back. "Reese." Reese twitched, his body jerking like a puppet on tangled strings. "You have to see it." Then he lunged. Daniel barely had time to react. He stumbled backward, hands scrambling against the console. Reese's fingers dug into his arm, ice cold and wrong, pulling him closer. A single command flashed on the monitor. Manual override. Initiate emergency ascent. Daniel didn't think. He slammed his palm against the button. Alarms blared. The ship screamed. The 2099th shuddered violently, as if it was fighting against the ascent. The walls convulsed, the metal groaning in protest. The ship didn't want to let them go. Reese shrieked. The shadows around him convulsed, tendrils snapping toward Daniel. But the emergency escape pod detached. Daniel's body was ripped away from Reese's grasp, sucked into the force of the ascent. His ears rang from the pressure shift. He barely managed to secure his mask before everything became a blur of rising darkness and water. The ship below twisted, warped, collapsing inward as though being swallowed by something unseen. And then, light. Daniel's pod breached the surface. He gasped, pulling in air, real air, his body shaking uncontrollably. The research vessel was ahead. The other divers were already being pulled aboard. Someone was shouting his name. Hands gripped his suit, yanking him onto the deck. But all he could do was stare at the ocean. Below the surface, far beneath where the 2099 had once been, something moved. A shape. A presence. Still waiting. Still watching. A final whisper crackled in his earpiece. "Not your time yet." The cover-up and the final warning. Daniel sat on the edge of the research vessel, the cold sea breeze biting against his damp skin. His hands trembled as he clutched the thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from something deeper, something that had settled inside his bones since the moment he had surfaced. Something wrong. The 2099 was gone. No wreckage, no trace of the ship remained beneath the waves, only the memories, and the ones who never made it back. Beside him, Reynolds was speaking into a radio, his voice tight and clipped. The other divers were shaken but alive, yet the absence of Reese and Burke was louder than any voice on board. No one spoke about what they had seen. No one even tried to. Daniel's mind reeled, images flashing behind his eyes. The warped bodies, the whispering shadows. Reese's empty, blackened eyes as he reached for him. He should have drowned down there. He should have never made it back. A chopper appeared on the horizon, the deep thudding of its rotors breaking through the heavy silence. The moment it landed, men in unmarked uniforms stepped onto the deck, their faces emotionless, their movements swift and deliberate. Daniel recognized the look in their eyes. These weren't rescue operatives, they were clean up. A tall man in a black suit approached Reynolds. He didn't introduce himself, he didn't need to. All data has been retrieved. His voice was sharp, mechanical. Reynolds hesitated. We lost connection during the dive. We'll take it from here. The man's gaze swept over the crew, cold and calculating. You will be debriefed immediately. Daniel clenched his fists. The nightmare wasn't over. It never would be. The crew was ushered into a holding area below deck. Papers were placed in front of them. Non-disclosure agreements. Daniel barely read his before a pen was shoved into his hand. He was supposed to sign his silence away, to pretend that the 2099 had never existed, that Reese had never reached for him with something else moving beneath his skin, that something in the abyss hadn't whispered his name. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His fingers tightened around the pen. Is this a joke? One of the younger divers scoffed, pushing the papers away. You can't just make us forget what we saw. The man in black stepped forward, his presence towering. His voice was calm. You didn't see anything. A hush fell over the room. Daniel's heart pounded. Reynolds swallowed hard. He signed his name. One by one, the others followed. Daniel hesitated. His pulse roared in his ears. But what choice did he have? He scrawled his name across the paper, the ink bleeding into the page like a stain he would never erase. The moment the last signature was given, the men in black moved efficiently. Hard drives were confiscated, cameras and gear were taken, the data logs wiped. It was as if the mission had never happened, as if the 2099 had never existed. The research vessel was ordered back to shore. No one spoke the entire way back. That night, Daniel sat alone in his motel room, staring at the logbook he had hidden beneath his suit before the debriefing. The last words from the ship's captain stared back at him. Not a storm, not a current. It was waiting. A sharp knock at his door. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Slowly he stood, moving toward the door. When he opened it, no one was there. Just an envelope. His name was written on the front. He bent down, picked it up with shaking fingers, and tore it open. A single note. Forget what you saw, it's not your time. Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned his head toward the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. Outside, beneath the glow of the streetlights, a figure stood in the shadows. A deep-sea diving suit. The visor cracked, the face beneath it, impossibly dark. And then, a single static-ridden whisper in his radio earpiece. See you soon. Like and subscribe for more chilling discoveries and mysterious stories from the deep. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.